So now we'll be recording, just so you're all aware. And we're going to get started. So now I would actually like to introduce Karen Shalev, our Student Entrepreneurship Ambassador, to get us going with our straight talk from top leaders. Karen?
Thank you, Christy, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Karen Shalev. I am a junior in the honors program, double majoring in visual and performing arts and communication. As Christy mentioned, I'm part of the Entrepreneurship Ambassadors program and also participating in the Idea Accelerator program this semester, which prepares Worcester State students to take on roles like those of our amazing panelists. So let's introduce our panelists today. Our first panelist is Marianne Harrison, the President and CEO of John Hancock, the US division of Toronto-based Manulife Financial Corporation, where she's also part of the executive leadership team. Ms. Harrison has a BA in English from the University of Western Ontario and a diploma in accounting from Wilfrid Laurier University. Our second panelist is Bob Maresca, Chairman of the Board at Bose Corporation. He was previously the President and CEO of Bose. Mr. Maresca has a BS in Mechanical Engineering from MIT and a Master's in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science from Stanford University. Our third panelist is Scott Soares, the owner of Boston Bay Consulting, where he offers government relations services, business and project development, and management assistance to those working in agriculture, fisheries, and food systems. Mr. Soares has a double major in biology and marine biology from UMass Dartmouth and has completed coursework in aquaculture and fisheries at the University of Rhode Island. Mr. Soares has also spent 7 years in active and reserve service to the US Army. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today for what is sure to be an inspirational session. With that, I will turn it over to Steve Dorval, our moderator for today, to get this panel started.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. Appreciate it. And thank you to Marianne and to Bob and to Scott. And thank you to everybody for coming. For those who don't know, I'm Steve Dorval, and I'm an entrepreneur in residence helping out in the Center for Entrepreneurship here. And I'm going to be moderating the panel, which mostly means, based on the prep session that we did, me throwing out a question and then letting these incredibly bright and engaging people share their story with all of you. So my goal is to speak little and to help facilitate the conversation. And hopefully you get to have the opportunity to hear some wisdom to help understand how you can go from the seats you're sitting in to the seats that they're sitting in potentially, and have that aspiration and understand what's possible. So as Christy mentioned, if you do have questions, feel free to put them into the chat. I'll be monitoring those questions and either leave them till the end or look for opportunities to weave them into the discussion as it goes along. So with that, what I wanted to really start off, Karen did a great job of giving the backstory in terms of the CV/resume, but I wanted to ask each of the panelists to be able to share a little bit about themselves and sort of that journey from your seat as a student to the pinnacle of their careers where they are right now. So I'm going to take advantage of familiarity. I actually used to work for Marianne up till a couple of years ago, so I'll ask Marianne to go first and share her story.
Well, thanks, Steve. I'm grateful I'm here because I actually got kicked off through your entire introduction and I just managed to get back on. So yeah. It's good to be here. My path is a little different than I guess I would have anticipated, which is not surprising, I think, for a lot of people. You guys probably wouldn't have recognized the universities that she spoke about that I attended, because I'm Canadian, actually, and I grew up in Canada. And so I actually got my undergrad was in English, which is a topic I really loved. I loved English, but I knew that there wasn't an opportunity to get a career that I wanted. So I took a lot of business courses at the same time. And I ended up going to a public accounting firm. I worked with PricewaterhouseCoopers for about 12 years and was in their financial services practice, and then ended up going from there to a TD Bank, and then over to Manulife, which is a very large insurance company in Canada. And I spent 5 years as the corporate controller there within the finance world. And then at the end of 5 years, I kind of said, I wanted to do something different. I'd been in finance my entire career. And so they put out an opportunity for me, and they said, would you be interested in moving to the US to run a long-term care business? And at the time, I'd never run a business before. They said it was a nice, easy business to run. So I said, sure, I would come. And joined in March of 2008. And I think many of you may know what happened at the end of 2008. We had a financial crisis. And it was a really interesting job. I learned so much, and I had to do so many different management techniques that I'd never tried before. I'd never been a general manager, and so thrown into the water. And it was quite an interesting job, probably my favorite job, actually. And then from there, I went back to Canada to run our Canadian business, spent 4 years doing that. And now I'm back in the US again, running John Hancock. So I've been doing that for 3 years now. So a very interesting career path, going in multiple different directions, but it's been a lot of fun.
Great. Thank you, Marianne. One of the things I love about this panel is we have folks from all different parts of the economy. So I thought I'd jump over to Scott, who really represents, public policy and public advocacy part of really the economy. So Scott, share a little bit about your journey.
Sure. Thanks, Steve, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm really happy to be here, and don't feel like it was that long ago that I was where many of you are right now. In fact, and coming out of high school, I really wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, which is in large part why I ended up enlisting for the Army and going into the service, and then ultimately getting out of Oklahoma by volunteering for jump school and going down to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and spending some time down there. But I appreciated the public service aspect of that work to the extent that when I got out of active service, I stayed in the National Guard, and at the same time enrolled in what at the time was Southeastern Massachusetts University. That's funny, if I say SMU now, many folks think it's Southern Methodist University, and I don't necessarily always correct them, but it was SMU when I started, and then UMass Dartmouth by the time I finished. But all throughout that time, I was interested in what I could do to explore more around the science angles of biology and specifically marine biology, but also to integrate that with policy work. I had designs early on of trying to work for the state of Massachusetts, that is, and doing some work to help integrate science with policy. Which thankfully I was able to do in the earliest days of aquaculture development here in Massachusetts, back when Governor Weld, and this was in the early 90s, had started to look at what could we do in Massachusetts to compete with salmon production up in Maine and oyster production down in Connecticut, with an industry that was just really getting started. Gave me the opportunity through the agency, through a grant at that point, to integrate my help with a variety of different state agencies. And throughout that time, I think more than anything, loving what I did is really what helped me continue to do the work, because I did a lot of work with the growers themselves and with the industry. And that wasn't only with shellfish growers at that time, but with also growers of any number of crops, that gave me the ability to work with folks across a broad range of expertise and different kinds of industries. That again, I really appreciated the public service aspect of all of that work. So I kept doing that work all the way through, and didn't expect any changes to come along until in 2017, when then Governor-elect Patrick was elected. I got a call, and many find this interesting when I mentioned, I remember the call because it was a 6:30 p.m. call on the January 7th when I was in my office in Boston. And as was my typical, I was probably the last person in the office. That contrary to what many folks think about state employees, my experience has been there's a lot of folks that are really dedicated to what they do, and I was really proud to be among them. So I got the call, and at that time was asked to step up to see if I'd be interested in the acting commissioner's position at the Department of Ag Resources. Never had any aspirations to lead the organization, organization that was established 150 years ago. As one of the first departments of ag here in the country, in fact, that it gave me the opportunity to really stretch out and to try some of the things that I thought needed to be done to help accelerate not only aquaculture, but just food access, food system development in Massachusetts, and was really privileged to do that until I was asked whether or not I wanted to step into the full-time position, and stayed with the state of Massachusetts right up until the 2015, and then moved on to work with the cranberry industry here in Massachusetts, again, as their executive director, to help with the Cape cranberry. If you all are familiar with the Got Milk mustache commercials, there's an organization called the Cranberry Marketing Committee that does the same thing for cranberries that the Got Milk people did for the dairy industry. So I had an opportunity to stay in Massachusetts, which is what my original plan was, but also to work with one of the leading agricultural organizations and industries here in Massachusetts, and got some more leadership experience working with the Cranberry Marketing Committee that also integrated with some of the federal systems, and learning more about the cross section between state policy, industry, as well as government regulation, and how do you integrate those different components. So I stayed along with the Cranberry Marketing Committee until another opportunity came up to jump into the federal government to work with USDA during the Obama administration with an organization called the USDA Rural Development. That although it wasn't specific to agriculture, although it was based on the fact that most agricultural businesses occur in rural communities, that it was much broader than that. It also got into financing and loans and community development activity, projects such as accessing water for different communities, or housing, or any number of community infrastructures that ultimately USDA Rural Development funded. So I looked at it as not knowing the job entirely before I got it, but really being anxious to learn more about it. So again, the theme of public service throughout, I think, is what carried me to accepting that position with USDA Rural Development. And again, seeing how I could integrate, not only some of the policy issues that I had already learned, but seeing how I could better help, those not only in my own community, but in communities around Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island. So finally, after my experience with USDA, it was time for me to move on. A new administration was coming in. And it was at that point that I started to think more about maybe doing my own thing and providing consulting services to any number of the businesses that I had previously worked with, either in land agriculture or water aquaculture, and the food system folks that I had worked with, not only to help them with their own businesses, but to help guide them to the various resources that were available, not only at the state level, but also the federal level. And there are many, and they evolve year after year, and especially now after a year like we had in 2020, the volume of programs and volumes of services. I've always seen myself as more or less an advocate and ombudsman to help guide people to those different services, and again, in the public service realm, but trying to translate that into a private business, which was a bit of a challenge, but it was both enjoyable and I think impactful for those folks that I've worked with. So to date, and currently, most of my work now is with, again, providing guidance to various public programs, both state and federal, and doing a lot of work right now, in fact, with a group called the Aquaculture Association here in Massachusetts. And as I mentioned, not only guiding them to the various resources that are available, but helping them to form their own organization through their trustees, going through a board development and trying to bring some of the experience that I've had through those various positions that I mentioned to help them better represent what is a growing industry, no pun intended, here in Massachusetts. So again, I'm very happy to be here. I'm looking forward to some great questions from all of you, and always looking forward to opportunities that I can help any of you folks along the way. So I'm sure you'll have contact information after this, so don't ever hesitate to reach out if you think there's something that I can do to help you move ahead in your own interests. So again, happy to be here.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it. Bob, I'd love to hear a little bit from you about your experience at Bose Corporation. Oop, you're on mute.
How's that? There we go. So happy to talk about Bose, but I was thinking about getting the opportunity to talk to students today, and it brought me back to when I was 19 years old as a student, and probably a lot of you are thinking about where your career is going to go, and you probably have thought about it more than I did. I was not very good at career planning. In fact, I only went to college to play football, and after a year of college, I realized I wasn't going to make any money playing football, so I actually quit college, and I became a construction worker down in New York City. So I was on the 50th floor of a building, and that was going to be my career. And fortunately, I had somebody reach out to me. It was an uncle. He's actually the only uncle. My parents hadn't been to college, and this was the only uncle I had that had been to college. He went on the GI Bill, government sent him, and he had gone to MIT, and he convinced me to apply there. And lo and behold, I got in, and I fell in love with engineering. So I gave up my love for football, and I transferred it to my love of engineering. And, I just wanted to invent things and, practice my craft. And I went to Hewlett Packard's research labs, and I went to Philips Research Labs, and ended up at Bose's research labs in Framingham. Turns out Dr. Bose was a professor of mine at MIT, and he had offered me a job after I graduated from MIT, but I decided to go out to Stanford to graduate school, and we stayed in touch. And eventually he got me to join the company in 1986 as a researcher. And I stayed in research for 15 years at Bose and loved it, never wanted to do anything else. And one day he called me into his office and said, I thought we were going to talk about a research project. And we had a failing business, which was actually the noise canceling business. Some of you may be familiar with our noise canceling products. We started doing that for the military and for aviation, because it was very expensive when we started. Technology was very expensive. And that business had been failing, losing tens of millions of dollars. And he told me he wanted me to run the business. Now, unlike Marianne, who was smart enough to take business courses when she was in college, even though she loved English, I was not smart enough to take business courses. I took all math and science courses, which I loved. But I felt woefully underqualified for the job. But most of the problems that the business had were technical problems. So I got in there, and it's one of those things where I would never have chosen it. And had Dr. Bose not convinced me to take it, I never would have taken it. But I learned a really valuable lesson that, sometimes you need to take a leap and get uncomfortable and take on something that you just don't know how to do it. And you're going to have to figure it out on the fly. And it's terrifying, but it expands your horizons. And I brought all my technical thinking to leadership and management, and within 3 weeks figured out that it wasn't worth very much. And the way I explained it to Dr. Bose was, if you have a good experiment, you can put an input in, you get an output, you can reproduce it the next day. If it's a linear system, you can double the input, you'll double the output. It's very predictable. I said, I love that about math and science. I said, but if you talk to people, you can say the same thing to 10 different people and get 10 different reactions. I said, what's even scarier, you can say the same thing to the same person on 10 different occasions and get 10 different reactions. I said, you can't solve this problem. And he was very wise and a great mentor to me. And he kind of smiled and he said, Bob, no, you can't solve people with equations. And I started reading everything I could get my hands on with regard to leadership and management. And I never would have done that had I not been thrown into this challenge. And it really forced me to expand my horizons. And I didn't think of it as a career. I considered it a way to solve problems. And, that eventually he asked me to become president and CEO of the company. And we ran into 2008. Now, 2008, the global financial crisis, nobody would ask for something like that. That was brutal. But, we dug down deep and I learned a lot about myself, and we had to figure out a way to get through it. And the bonds that you create when you go through something really, really challenging with people last a lifetime. And then just recently, I had actually retired as CEO in January 1st of 2018. Well, January 1st of 2020, I needed to come back. We had to replace the CEO. So I had to come back as the acting CEO for 2020. And one piece of advice that I'll say to anybody who's thinking about coming out of retirement, do not do it in 2020. Because that was a year to remember, or to forget, I should say. There were more challenges that year than I can ever remember in my career. But again, For me, the bigger the problem, the more of the opportunity to learn, to grow, to do things together with other people. That's where leadership really, really counts, when the chips are down and you really don't know whether you're going to make it. And things were looking pretty bleak last April and May. We were burning $75 million a month, and we didn't know if we were going to be solvent. Who knew how long the recession was going to last? But we were able to turn that around and get the company back on track and growing and profitable. So I'm very, very proud of that. Long story short, I never wanted to be in management. I just wanted to do technology. But in retrospect, I thank Dr. Bose for his faith in me and for giving me the opportunity, and for allowing me to grow in ways that I couldn't have imagined. So happy to answer any questions you might have when we get to that point.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I think the thing I'd take from each of their stories and point out to all of you is, there are very few linear paths in your career. Very few people started a job and know exactly, even though people will ask you in interviews, where do you see yourself in 5 years or 10 years? It's a false question. You're going to take twists and turns. And as you've heard, everybody here, really never planned on ending up where they're ending up, and just continue to do a great job and solve problems. And when you do that, you get opportunities. So that's fantastic. Bob, I think there's a good jumping off point, because there's two things I really want to hit on in this session. One is what the experience of being a leader during the pandemic in 2020 has been like. And if you could, what do you think the sort of the persistent changes that are as a result of everything that we've gone through and are continuing to go through during this experience that you're going to have? The other thing we're going to cover, so everybody knows, is also just a little bit about what folks are looking for in terms of skill set, and especially for those who've been involved in the entrepreneurial activity, that entrepreneurial mindset. How does it fit into what leaders are looking for from the workers of the future? So Bob, I don't know if you could take that, since you were starting to jump into what the experience was like last year.
Yeah, I mean, you not only do you learn a lot about yourself, you learn a lot about your coworkers. When you're faced with a crisis, I've always looked at a crisis as an opportunity. There's so much that needs to be done. There's so much that's unknown. There are certain people that in a crisis, they step up and they figure out how to help. And it's those people that you build those bonds with, because together, shoulder to shoulder, you find a way to succeed. It was tough this year. We actually were in tough shape in January before the virus hit. As I mentioned, we had to change the CEO. So we had been on a bad path, and we had some tough changes in front of us. But then when COVID hit in the middle of March, and we could no longer go into the buildings, we had to scramble to figure out how are we going to get our work done virtually. And in our case, a lot of our products are manufactured all over the world: Malaysia, China, Thailand, Mexico. And our engineers would be flying to these places to do the prototype runs. And all of a sudden, we could not travel. And they say necessity is the mother of invention. None of us would have believed that we could be as productive as we were via video conference. And, as we contemplate coming back to, quote, normal, the new normal won't be the same as the old normal. It's a 24-hour trip to get to China, to the plants. We're really going to think long and hard before we do that again, because we were pretty effective at working with our partners over there via video conference. We get better and better at it. And, we probably got 90% of the productivity. Yes, we will go over maybe once a year now, but we're not going to go over there at the drop of a hat anymore. So the general consensus is that business travel will not come back. That has implications on the airlines, has implications on us too as leisure travelers, because if the airlines are not making their money on the business travelers, they're going to be trying to make money on us. I think the fares are going to get pretty high. There's going to be a lot of demand. So I do think that we're not going to go back to 5 days a week in the office. That has major implications on commercial real estate, on the number of buildings that we own, that we maintain, on our workspaces. We may go to hoteling, where there are spaces where you can just put your laptop down for the day and work there, but you don't actually have an office. And maybe people come in 2 or 3 days a week. I do think it's important for people to come in and see people face to face. I think it's maybe an under valued portion of leadership and teamwork. You need to develop trust with people, and you can do it virtually, but there needs to be some interaction personally. In our case, we actually found a CEO, and I brought her on board September 1st and overlapped with her for the final 4 months of the year. So try, number one, recruiting a CEO without meeting them, other than via video conference. And number two, then onboarding a CEO without her being able to meet all the employees. And you know what? I'll be honest with everybody here. I was not at all comfortable doing video conferences. The first time that you hear your voice recorded or you see yourself on video, it kind of, is a little unsettling. Boy, you better get good at video conferencing, because it is the way we're going to communicate. And for me, it's turned out it's another growth opportunity for me. The first week I was not very comfortable, and I'm like, geez, I hope this doesn't last very long. But after about 3 weeks, I'm like, you better get used to this, and you better get good at it. I'm actually on my iPhone now because we had a cyber attack and my laptop is corrupted. So I figured out a way to do it on my iPhone. And so the technology has been great and has enabled us to work together in some ways closer than we ever have before. We're an international company. We've got 8,000 employees around the globe. And I think the international folks always felt like kind of second-class citizens because they were on video conference and everybody else was together at the corporate headquarters. Now we're all on video conference. We're all on an even playing field, and I'm closer to my global colleagues than I ever have been before. So there are actually, there are some good things that come out of this. We've learned a lot going through this crisis. And we'll make use of that, when we get on the other side.
That's great. Thanks, Bob. Marianne, do you want anything to follow up on that?
Sure. When the crisis hit, we had to move pretty quickly. And I think that everybody did. I really do think that a lot of things we had done before the crisis actually came upon us really benefited us. And Steve, you'll remember, we had a pretty good work from home contingent. About 30% of our employees were working from home. Now, that wasn't 100% of our employees. And literally on a Thursday night at 5 o'clock, I sent out an email to 5,000 people saying, Friday morning, you're all working from home. So it was a real test to see whether or not we could do this or not. As a matter of fact, we were going to do a test. And the way that everything transpired, we didn't have time for a test. And the most important thing was the health of our employees and their well-being. So we wanted to get them out of the office quickly. Remarkably, our technology held up phenomenally well. So I think the fact that we had already done some work from home really helped us to be able to transition there. But I guess as a leader in that environment, one of the things that became very apparent, as Bob's saying, everybody's on the same playing field. Everybody's all of a sudden at home, but there needed to be a lot more connection. When you're in the office, it's different when you're bumping into people all the time and having side chats. You don't have that all of a sudden when everybody's on video. So we really wanted to connect with the employees. And so communications became incredibly important. I was doing weekly videos. I was doing town halls every week, answering questions, ask me anything questions to anyone that they wanted. And it was really important to me to be transparent and to communicate as much as possible so that the employees knew what was going on and we were having these open dialogues. We also really wanted to do something different and we talk a lot in our values about sharing our humanity. And one of the things that the communications team said is we'd like you guys to take videos for the senior management team of what you're doing on the weekends. So what are some of the things you do on the weekends? And anybody who knows me knows, I don't like the camera. And B, I generally keep my work and my private life separate. So it was a real uncomfortable experience for me, all of a sudden welcoming all my employees into my home. And we have a traditional Saturday night pizza. And so took video of everybody making pizza. And it's just a really different perspective. And it was interesting to see how, not just with myself, but a lot of people were starting to blend work and home much more together, and people talking differently than they'd ever talked when they were in the office, and being much more open and sharing a lot more about themselves. And I think, as Bob said, we became much more connected as an organization as a result of that. So it was really nice to see that employee engagement went up, connectivity went up around employees. So a very different perspective. And I do think it's easier when you're all in the same playing field. When you start to think about transitioning back to the office, and some people working from home and some people not working from home, that's complicated, and it's going to take us some time to think through how do you really do that, because all of a sudden you're not on the same playing field. And even with our 30% we had working from home prior to, there were still some challenges that we faced. So making sure that now that we have both experiences, how do you really work in the environment and make it work for everybody? So lots of interesting challenges, but as Bob said, taking these challenges and turning them into opportunities is something that has been very valuable for us. As a matter of fact, before the pandemic hit, we were trying to do a lot more digitization. And if anybody knows anything about the insurance industry, it's not a very seamless process when you're buying insurance products and investment products. It's complicated. It's a little bit convoluted. So, we were taking the opportunity to try and digitize a lot of our processes. And interestingly enough, pre-pandemic, we couldn't get people taking us up on using them. All of a sudden, the pandemic hit, and everybody wanted to get into our digitized processes. So it was a real opportunity for us. And so what we've been trying to do during the pandemic is, okay, how do we go faster? Because we're never going back. We're never going back to that old way of the paper forms. How do we go faster? And so we've been doing a lot of sort of testing and learning and innovating and doing these 90-day sprints. Like, what can we do in 90 days to digitize processes and go super fast and getting a lot of collaboration happening? And the employees are loving it. Like, they're working across businesses and functions in order to get things done like they've never done in the past. So I do think that these crises can be turned into opportunities. And that's a lot about what being a leader is. How do you take these negative situations and try and turn them into a positive for your employees, for your business? And I think there's a lot that can be done. So a lot of great learnings that have come out of it from our perspective, and a lot of new ways of doing things, which I am confident are going to stick forever.
Awesome. Scott, you obviously are dealing with smaller organizations, different type of scale. What was your experience, both for you and for your people you work with?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. I think coming into it, it was helpful being an eternal optimist. That regardless of the challenge that was ahead of it, it was monumental, especially for the shellfish growers, and I'll get into that in a moment. Is looking at it from the perspective of, as you've heard the previous speakers mention, is what opportunities come from these challenges. So in regard to the shellfish industry for here in Massachusetts, and specifically the oyster growers, many didn't know before the pandemic that actually the third most valuable landed seafood in Massachusetts was farm-raised oysters, only behind lobster and sea scallop, two very valuable species. So oysters were pretty popular economically going back to 2019. Well, of course, most of their product, in fact, virtually 100% of it was sold on the half shell through restaurants. So guess what happened when restaurants closed? The markets for farm-raised oysters, any oysters for that matter, dried up entirely. These guys had nowhere to go, and they had grown in the previous year 50 million oysters, just 50 million oysters just in Massachusetts. And those were oysters that were going all over the world, all over Massachusetts, all over the country. So what could be done? Well, we started looking, and this is where biology started to help out. In fact, that oysters continue to grow. They may not be good for the half shell market when that market came back around, whenever that might be. So what could we do? And ultimately starting to look at how we could diversify the industry so that the oyster growers weren't just a one-trick pony. In other words, only able to sell their oysters to restaurants on the half shell. Well, how can we start to look at going back 100 years ago when there were shucking shacks up and down mid-Atlantic and in the Pacific Northwest, and you could get shucked oysters, and oysters were in fact defined as every man's food because it was so plentiful. how can we get some of that diversity back in the industry? So thankfully, there were a number of organizations out there, and I think the take home first is being attentive. So watching for what opportunities come along, because there were a number of organizations out there that not only wanted to help support the food system, and the hunger issue is still a challenge today, but even more so when the pandemic came on, is how could they help offset some of the hunger issues that many were dealing with? But at the same time, how can they support some of those in the industry who are producing some of that food product? So for the oyster growers, it was a matter of finding some of the funds that ultimately could buy oysters from growers, pay for those oysters to be shucked in brand new shucking facilities that hadn't been tried in Massachusetts, at least by only a handful of companies, trying to expand on that capacity, and then getting those oysters ultimately donated to food banks so that we could get more product into the food banks to help address the hunger issues, but at the same time coordinating that with the growers all the way up. Fortunately, by being attentive and finding the right organizations, those that had some of the funds, we were able to line all those pieces together. And I'll tell you, coming into the pandemic, and it's great to go through strategic planning processes and to get plans made up for the next 5 years. But when something like the COVID-19 pandemic hits, that's not something folks ever planned for, in my experience. So being flexible and the ability to, again, be attentive for when those, not only the challenges are framed, but how can you line those with the opportunities, really came in handy to help really give some money much needed to the growers who otherwise were not seeing any kind of relief at all for the sale of their product. And at the same time, start to diversify the industry so it'd be more resilient moving forward into the future. And now, like you've heard from the previous speakers, integrating some of what we've done in 2020 by providing greater resiliency to the industry, providing greater exposure to new products and new product forms, integrating new folks into the industry who ultimately support things like better processing and better preparation of different kinds of oyster products in this case. It's going to persist into the future. So again, the industry is going to come out of this a lot stronger than when it went into it, right, based on the resiliency that they'll now have going forward. So again, I think the take home from my experience was being attentive and really speaking with a lot of folks who are on the ground, integrating all of those ideas with where you might want to go and trying to vet those out, but not being afraid to ask what some might define as the stupid question, quote unquote, because as I'm sure many of you have heard, there's no such thing. And that is very true, again, with a year like 2020, where many folks may not have even considered the question because they didn't know the problem. They didn't really know the really intimate issues that some of the growers themselves were dealing with, even at a small level. So again, being attentive to what those problems were and trying, any number of avenues to identify ways that you could address those problems is what is really to not only make the industry come out along, that many believe, including myself, but also to help raise up new leaders in the industry. So I think that's another role for any leader, is to look at with those that you work with and to try to raise up all of those around you so that they too can kind of step into the leadership role at some point, and if not immediately, based on the challenges that are in front of them.
That's great. Again, looking for themes, I think, consistently it was a matter of needing to take on and just deal with the situation as it presented itself and being nimble and flexible to saying, how do you take this situation and turn a negative into a positive and do it quickly and test and learn and try different things. Same thing with when we're, moving along and getting a lot of really interesting thoughts out there, but we're starting to get close to running out of time. I'm going to stay nimble and keep us moving. We do have one question who came in. I want to make sure we don't miss out on. Lenny was following up on something that Bob had mentioned around, sort of self-teaching himself some management books. So I guess for each of you, what are one or two management books that you would recommend to, or business books that you would recommend to this group that, that have either been influential to you or you think would be good for them?
I'll start with The Leadership Challenge by Kouzes and Posner. And I'll just summarize the most interesting thing out of the book is they asked people what were the most valued characteristics of a leader, things they admired most in a leader. And they did that through 4 decades, through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and first decade of the millennial. And there were like 30 different aspects of leadership that they admired, but they were through the 4 decades, 4 things ended up in the top 4 spots. They switched positions, but it was always the top 4. And they also did it in 7 different cultures, in Europe and Asia and across and the same 4 showed up of all of these things. And they were, 2 of them are really personal attributes, your integrity and your competence. And the other 2 were forward-looking, someone who's forward-looking, looking to the future, looking to build a future, and somebody who's inspirational. So the book is great as a leadership book. So whether you're in business leading or you're leading a volunteer committee at church, those 4 things, and by the way, this goes all the way back to Aristotle in 450 BC. He came up with the same thing 2,500 years ago. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say it'll probably, if it lasted for 2,500 years, it's probably going to last for another 2,500. So the leadership challenge is a great one. Another one is Getting to Yes, the Harvard Negotiation Project. Really, really great book about really about dealing with people. Some great examples there, whether you're dealing with your spouse or a friend or people at work, people who work for you, people you work for. It's a fantastic book.
Great. Scott, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. I had 2 that I'll suggest. One is a pretty quick read, and it's not specifically, I don't think, designed as a leadership book, although I think it really had this, the effect of being a great leadership book, was Watering the Bamboo by Greg Bell. And ultimately that book focuses on the analogy of, folks who ultimately may water bamboo for, in some cases, years before it actually finally does anything. And then finally one day it does really take off. And for me, the analogy to my own career, it's about continuing to do the work that you love and continue to do the best job that you can, and that will bear fruit. Continue to look at the theme of hard work paying off, and I would recommend that book. The other is one that you probably may be familiar with, The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. Again, another not specific leadership book, but the stories that he writes about throughout really provide some insight into what it takes to get to different strategies, different solutions, different developments, based on timing and based on work that's led up to the timing and the alignment of those things. So I would recommend those 2 as kind of my picks for folks to consider.
Great. Marianne?
So I'm interesting. I don't read any books around. You probably know this, Steve. I don't read any leadership books. Being an English major, I read to get away from work, to be quite honest, and to enjoy my time. So I'll make that easy for you and save some time.
Yep. There you go. So I will take Moderator's prerogative and give you 2 of my suggestions, which one is Built to Last, which
excellent.
is a fantastic book. And then it has been a long time since I've read it, but Peter Drucker's The Effective Executive was also very good in terms of actually another question that came up around how do you manage yourself and manage your time. So, again, we want to try to get to some thoughts around the entrepreneurial mindset, but I definitely want to make sure we hit on questions because it takes some courage to put them out there. So one question is, how do you deal with time management and organization? So, Marianne, I'll give it to you the floor to start with time management. I know you've got a very busy personal life and a very busy executive life, so you are nobody better to ask about that.
Yeah, well, actually, my personal life was even more so a number of years back, as Steve's alluding to the fact that I have 4 kids. So it has been a very interesting career path for me. And I've always said to people that, sometimes in your career, there may be spots where you need to slow down a little bit and get that balance right and make sure you have it right. So when my kids were really young, I probably did take a little bit more time, but I never stepped out of the workforce because I always knew how important it was going to be. They'd get to a point in their lives where they didn't need me as much as I needed them, and I would want my career. So I always make sure that people really plan carefully, especially if you're having young kids. You just have to be flexible. And for me, I said I was outsourcing long before outsourcing became a thing in the workplace. I outsourced all the things that I didn't want to do, the cleaning, the cooking, the washing the clothes, so that when I came home, all my time was undivided time with my kids. And as a result of that, we have got an unbelievable relationship. I now have 4 kids that are all in their 20s. And we're constantly with each other and just great relationships because of the fact that we really focused. And I never compromised. I never compromised on my kids, and I don't feel that I compromised on my career at all. And I look back and I don't have any regrets at all. And I think it's all about that time management and focusing on what's important, what's not important, get it out of your life. You don't need it, and do what you have to do to get by. People always ask me, how did you do it? And I said, I don't know, I just did it. And when the kids were younger, and even now, people will always say, well, what are your hobbies? What do you like to do? And I say, my kids are my hobbies. I know that sounds really strange, but it was important to me that every moment outside of work was dedicated to my kids. And like I said, as a result of that, we have very strong bonds today. And so I think you just have to figure out what works for you. And outsourcing might not be working for everybody, but planning and making sure that you do have a good plan is what's really important to time management and getting that balance. And I might also add, we were talking about the work from home. All the statistics are saying that as all these companies move to work from home, the average workday was getting longer. So, people have to get better control over their time. And working from home didn't really help. It just meant there wasn't a commute. And then people were just putting that much more time into work. And I think, fairly early on, we had to figure out that's not sustainable. And so you really do have to set boundaries for yourself. And I think that's the most important piece.
Yeah, I saw somebody today ask, do we work from home or do we live at work? It's hard to say. Not sure what the difference is, really.
Exactly.
Bob, you have thoughts on time management organization? This is probably going to be the last thing, and then we'll do a wrap up. I don't want to abuse our time here, Christy.
I was a very active coach in football, basketball, baseball, and soccer, and I was always maintain that balance. And in fact, there was a time when I was at a meeting with Dr. Bose and some high-priced lawyers were doing a patent meeting on certain technologies, and it went till 5:30, and I had a tough dilemma. I said I had to stand up in front of everybody, and I was relatively new at the company, and I was essential for the meeting. But I said, look, Dr. Bose, I promised my 5-year-old daughter I would take her trick-or-treating, and I can't let her down, so I have to leave. And everybody in meeting just looked at me stunned, and I walked out and I went home, and my attitude on that, well, if that's not important to them, then this is not the right company for me to be working at. Work could suck up every single minute of your time if you let it. And of course, you need to be diligent and you need to get your work done, but you need to be disciplined about it, because without a balanced life, you're not going to perform at work. So I liked listening to Marianne and how she was disciplined about making sure that she always made time for her family, because it's critically important.
Great. Scott, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just echo everything that you heard from Bob and Marianne, and just to use a phrase associated with that, take time before it takes you. So dedicate time to yourself. And even if it's a matter of scheduling, like you schedule everything else, we have all these planners now that we use. Scheduling that time that you can dedicate to something you really enjoy to do that's not something other than work, it's critical to do that, because you really need to maintain that balance. It's really critical. Not to mention having a tolerant partner. My wife is very tolerant, so that helps a lot.
Man, well, that's great. Well, yes. Well, unfortunately, we could go on all day. Unfortunately, we don't have all day. If folks are interested in the books, Juma was nice enough to put it into the chat to make sure to list it. If we were running a podcast, I'd say we'll put it in the show notes. But I can actually take it down and we can try to send it out, email it to everybody if you do miss it. But if I could, Christy, I'll take 1 minute and see if anybody has any closing thoughts, and then we can wrap it up. And I appreciate everybody's time. Whoever wants to go first, I'll stop directing.
I'll just jump in and reiterate my offer in my opening remarks. I would encourage any of you, whether it's me or someone else, don't ever hesitate to reach out. You'll find out that folks, when they get into any number of leadership positions, they tend to be very generous with their time and thoughts. And I would encourage you all to reach out when you have questions about a potential career path or guidance that you're looking for in a particular subject. And and go ahead and don't hesitate to do that.
I might leave you with a closing thought is make sure you take lots of risks. I would never be where I am today if I didn't take risks, whether it was traveling across the border, back and forth across the border a couple of times, or, you know, getting out of finance and becoming a general manager. You just got to take risks and put yourself out there. You know, you're going to be the one that's going to be able to push your career forward, and you got to get out of that comfort zone and try something different.
Yeah, and I'll close with that, Marianne, and say that those risks often happen during crises. So, you know, when there's a tremendous need, there's an opportunity for people to step up and help. And by showing the courage to do that, even though I know it's scary because I've jumped off the cliff a few times, the analogy I use is, you know, there's a big chasm, you're on one side and there's a higher ground on the other side, but you got to jump across the cliff. And you know you can't reach it with a jump, but you jump off, and that stress causes you to grow wings to fly to the other side. But man, it's scary when you first jump off, you're going down, and you got to gradually grow those wings and get to the other side. But you know, you'll never grow the wings unless you take the leap. And during crises, there's opportunities to take that leap. And I know certainly in my case, Dr. Bose saw much more in me than I saw in myself. And, you know, I owe a lot to him for him believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. And it caused me to learn and to grow beyond what I could imagine.
That's great. Well, a couple of final thoughts from me. First off, thank you all. This has been fascinating. I was expecting it to be interesting. It ended up being even more interesting than I could have anticipated. Certainly appreciate that. Second, you know, Bob, I hope you're right and wrong on the airlines, because my favorite place to use my Bose noise canceling headphones is on the airplane. So I look forward to getting back to wearing those regularly. And then three, for anybody who isn't involved or, you know, participating in some of our activities with the Center for Entrepreneurship, please, I'd encourage you to do that. We do talk a lot about risk and, you know, how to take opportunities, but also how to de-risk some of those chances and what can you do to learn and test the waters. So feel free to reach out, participate in any of our programs. We'd love to have you if you haven't been part of it. So with that, I will hand it back to you, Kristen.
All right, great. Well, thank you. I want to thank all the panelists and Steve and Karen, and especially Elaine Vesio for encouraging your students to come to this, I know, and get some panelists. I appreciate that. On Friday, you're all going to receive a link in your email to complete a program evaluation. If you would just take a moment and provide us with your feedback on this session and other sessions you're attending this week, I really believe in improving for the next year. So we take the feedback and then we'll tweak our program. We also have a lot of resources at lead.worcester.edu under the symposium heading. We have book recommendations actually, and I'm grateful for the ones that I did here today because I love a leadership challenge. We use that in my office. But we also have another list of book recommendations in there, as well as other resources, podcasts and things online, and all kinds of resources for you. So please check that out. So again, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I hope you all enjoyed this. I thought it was very interesting. I learned a lot myself. So thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you too. It was my pleasure.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Steve.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.